Hi, this is Lit with Chris, and in this video I'll be exploring the ways in which George W. Bush used the art of rhetoric before and during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. As with any international conflict, there's a certain amount of context that we need to understand about why the war began in the first place. After that, I'll break down a number of rhetorical choices that Bush makes in order to convince those listening that an invasion was necessary for the US, for the Iraqi people, and the international community more broadly. So, to begin with, here's a little context. George W. Bush became the 43rd President of the United States of America on January 20th, 2001. Despite some early disputes about the validity of his election win, Bush's presidency went on to be defined by an event that occurred just 9 months later. On September the 11th, 2001, 4 passenger planes were hijacked and flown into civilian and governmental buildings in New York City and the state of Virginia, respectively. These were coordinated attacks made by the militant Islamist group Al-Qaeda, who, led by Osama bin Laden, were waging a holy war against the United States for what they claimed were crimes against Muslims around the world. In the aftermath of the attacks, and with a massive amount of civilian support, Bush succeeded in establishing the Bush Doctrine and beginning the so-called War on Terror. This gave the United States government authority to make preemptive strikes on other nations or regions suspected of harbouring or training what they perceived to be terrorist threats. The Bush administration's first invasion after 9/11 saw them enter Afghanistan on September 20th, 2001, after the Taliban, another militant Islamist group, refused to aid them in capturing and arresting Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leadership who were taking refuge in the country. Although the Taliban were defeated and forced to flee the country, hence making the nation a far more stable place to live, bin Laden escaped, and it could not be claimed that Al-Qaeda were completely defeated either. A year later, Osama bin Laden had still not been caught, and his whereabouts were unknown. Questions were therefore asked when Bush claimed that the next target of the war on terror was Iraq. Iraq at that time was led by a dictator named Saddam Hussein, who was widely regarded as a corrupt and cruel leader of his people. Despite this, many critics raised questions about why another costly and potentially deadly invasion was necessary when there was seemingly no links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. The US and UK governments both claimed to have intelligence that proved Hussein had weapons of mass destruction at his disposal that could be readied and fired in under an hour. Hence, an invasion and displacement of Hussein was necessary for world peace. Whether they doubted this evidence or simply opposed the idea of more war, Americans, Brits, and other nations protested in their millions, reflecting the fact that support for revenge or justice following the 9/11 attacks had somewhat changed. In addition, nations such as France and Russia did not agree that an invasion was necessary, a view shared by the UN Security Council. Conversely, the US and Britain continued plans to depose Saddam and regain control of the region. George W. Bush's speeches around the time of the Iraq War are a brilliant example of the ways in which leaders are prepared or trained to give upsetting, unfortunate, or even potentially divisive news in a way that seems acceptable for the intended audience. To do this, Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, once claimed that a speaker had to establish the respective appeals of ethos, pathos, and logos in their speeches. Ethos is the feeling or sense that the audience get when they feel that the speaker is experienced, knowledgeable, trustworthy, and/or has the best of intentions at heart. Pathos is the ability to recognize the current emotional state of the audience and potentially manipulate it to the desired outcome of the speaker. Lastly, logos is the way in which information is presented in a rational, deductive way, which represents plenty of proper planning and consideration for the matter at hand. By looking at some of George W. Bush's public appearances in 2002 and 2003, we can see these 3 appeals being used in order to convince the American public and those watching on from abroad that the invasion of Iraq truly was necessary. On the 7th of October 2002, Bush spoke in Cincinnati, Ohio, in order to address the nation on the threat of Iraq. During the course of the speech, he stated that many Americans have raised legitimate questions about the nature of the threat, about the urgency of action. These are all issues we've discussed broadly and fully within my administration, and tonight I want to share those discussions with you. Such an acknowledgement not only recognises the misgivings that many people around the world had about the war, but also implies that the everyday, ordinary citizens of the US will seemingly be informed and involved about conversations being had at the highest offices of government. Bush is presenting himself as a trustworthy leader of the country who does not wish to mislead or manipulate anyone, but instead include them as part of the deliberations. Bush goes on to claim that we know that Iraq and the Al-Qaeda terrorist network share a common enemy, the United States of America. We know that Iraq and Al-Qaeda have had high-level contacts that go back a decade. We've learned that Iraq has trained Al-Qaeda members in bomb-making and poisons and deadly gases, and we know that after September the 11th, Saddam Hussein's regime gleefully celebrated the terrorist attacks on America. Although relying on a number of language and structural devices that are also designed to elicit an emotional reaction, this listing of what sounds like military intelligence helps Bush to suggest that the American government has gathered sufficient data and can confidently and justifiably state that Iraq is a threat, hence enhancing his administration's claim to possess critical knowledge of the situation. Lastly, later in the speech, Bush states that we refuse to live in fear. This nation in World War and in Cold War has never permitted the brutal and lawless to set history's course. Now, as before, we will secure our nation, protect our freedom, and help others to find freedom of their own. These assertions help the president to underline his ultimate intentions, namely, to protect his country and to help those who are facing the supposed tyranny of Saddam Hussein more directly. Few would be able to argue, based on this rhetoric, that Bush and the government's intentions were anything other than a mission designed at establishing and maintaining world peace. On the 26th of February 2003, speaking in Washington, Bush delivered a new update on the future of Iraq. Near the beginning of his address, he reminds those gathered or watching at home that on a September morning, threats that had gathered for years in secret and far away led to murder in our country on a massive scale. As a result, we must look at security in a new way, because our country is a battlefield in the first war of the 21st century. Such a statement allows Bush to bridge the 18-month gap between 9/11 and the planned invasion of Iraq to establish a greater amount of credibility for the invasion. This is done through anticipating the skepticism being felt by some corners of the nation and replacing it with a sense of fear, injustice, and/or revenge that will promote greater support for the war. Later, Bush continues to speak pejoratively when explaining that in Iraq, a dictator is building and hiding weapons that could enable him to dominate the Middle East and intimidate the civilized world, and we will not allow it. This same tyrant has close ties to terrorist organizations and could supply them with the terrible means to strike this country. This first of all characterizes Saddam Hussein as someone who's not only a cruel and brutal dictator, but also a head of state who is both deceptive and potentially dangerous, given his supposed possession of nuclear weapons. This vilifies him in the eyes of the audience, who may be forced to accept that war is the only possible solution to reduce his threat. Finally, in order to show his benevolent side and quash any criticism of the war, Bush addresses the future of the Iraqi citizens when outlining that the nation of Iraq, with its proud heritage, abundant resources, and skilled and educated people, is fully capable of moving towards democracy and living in freedom. Such euphemistic language is designed to convey Bush's respect for the nation and their culture, and dismiss any sense that the United States might have ulterior motives than those previously stated. This not only helps to humanize the innocent victims of Saddam's regime, but it may push American voters to sympathize with their plight and therefore turn doubters to believers when it comes to the legitimacy of the war. Arguably, logos is the part of any speech that will be scrutinized the most. While pathos and ethos may be able to sway the public's opinion, expert politicians or journalists will forensically examine the logic or rationale used in a speech and publish their opinion in the hours that follow. Therefore, it is vital that leaders like Bush use logical arguments that are founded on strong reasoning. Such an example can be seen in his ultimatum to Saddam Hussein on March 17, 2003. Just days before the American invasion, Bush claims that for more than a decade, the United States and other nations have pursued patient and honourable efforts to disarm the Iraqi regime without war. That regime pledged to reveal and destroy all of its weapons of mass destruction as a condition for ending the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Since then, the world has engaged in 12 years of diplomacy. We have passed more than a dozen resolutions in the United Nations Security Council. We have sent hundreds of weapons inspectors to oversee the disarmament of Iraq. Our good faith has not been returned. This is a carefully considered sequence of claims. Bush outlines the numerous attempts in a 12-year period designed to prevent Hussein's supposed threat to the world. In finally stating that Saddam has not complied with these requests to disarm, Bush is able to offer a conclusion that force is the only reasonable option left for those concerned. He extends this later in the speech by explaining that this regime has already used weapons of mass destruction against Iraq's neighbours and against Iraq's people. The regime has a history of reckless aggression in the Middle East. It has a deep hatred of America and our friends, and it has aided, trained and harboured terrorists, including operatives of Al-Qaeda. The danger is clear. Using chemical, biological or one day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, the terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country or in any other. Once again, Bush makes a number of statements designed to build an understanding of the situation that will then allow him to reach a rational and reasonable conclusion. In this case, the president points out a number of supposedly factual elements of Iraq's recent foreign policy, all of which demonstrate their instability and commitment to hostility. In addition, the fact that they have weapons of mass destruction allows the speaker to reason that the lives of American people are at threat. Furthermore, Bush also deals with the sensitive topic of military losses when highlighting that should Saddam Hussein choose confrontation, the American people can know that every measure has been taken to avoid war. Americans understand the costs of conflict because we have paid them in the past. War has no certainty except the certainty of sacrifice. Yet the only way to reduce the harm and duration of the war is to apply the full force and might of our military. If Saddam Hussein attempts to cling to power, he will remain a deadly foe until the end. In desperation, he and terrorist groups might try to conduct terrorist operations against the American people and our friends. These attacks are not inevitable, they are, however, possible. And this very fact underscores the reason we cannot live under the threat of blackmail. The terrorist threat to America and the world will be diminished the moment that Saddam Hussein is disarmed. Here, Bush walks the audience, some of whom may be in the armed forces or have a family who serve in the military, through the possible ramifications of not invading Iraq. First of all, it appears to be the last thing the American government wanted in the first place, but with the supposed threat of Saddam growing, the president moves from one observation to the next, building to a conclusion in which to not act would mean living in paranoia and fear for the foreseeable future. All of which is designed to lead listeners to the plausible and deductive rationale that a swift and efficient invasion is for the benefit of all involved. The reasons to invade Iraq have not aged well in the eyes and minds of American and British people. The supposed and much discussed weapons of mass destruction were never actually discovered, and political leaks since have revealed that American interest in oil was amongst the secondary motivations to establish a military presence in the area. Democracy was attempted and elections were successfully held in Iraq to choose a new leader. But due to pressure and campaigning on the part of American people to reduce military presence in the area, the country has since sank back into political instability. At the time of recording, Transparency International ranks the Iraqi government as the 8th most corrupt government in the world. This was a future that many critics forecast at the outset of the Iraq War, but also one that George W. Bush successfully dismissed, thanks in part to the political context and tensions of the time, but also thanks to a powerful demonstration of rhetoric in each and every speech that he made. If you found this analysis useful and would like updates on when similar videos come out, then be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thank you very much for watching, and bye bye.